They took the sky first. Detective Rail Makini noticed it the way you notice a power outage. Not the darkness itself, but the sudden absence of everything that had always been there. Transit car ushered to a stop somewhere between Pershing Square and 7th Street, and the emergency strips went amber. And in that amber glow, he looked at his son across the aisle, and his son looked back at him with an expression neither of them had practiced yet. The expression for when the world ends. Deo was 22 and had spent the last 18 hours in a holding cell for breaking a man's nose over a gambling debt the man owed him. The irony of that, Deo owed nobody anything, had only ever been owed, was the kind of thing Rail had been rehearsing arguments about since the call came from the precinct. He'd had a whole speech, 3 years of silences between them, and he had finally constructed the architecture of something to say. And now the lights were going out in the tunnels under Los Angeles, and none of it mattered. Dad, that single syllable. He hadn't heard it in the voice of a man before, only in the voice of a boy, and the man's voice saying it was so close to the boy's that for a moment, something cracked inside Rail's sternum. Stay down, Rail said. Above them, though above was relative, above was just concrete and rebar and 30 feet of earth. Something was happening to the city. They could feel it in the bones of the tunnel. A vibration that wasn't mechanical, wasn't seismic, wasn't anything the body had words for. The other passengers in the car had gone quiet, in the way crowds go quiet when they understand they have become prey. Then, someone opened the tunnel access door at the far end of the platform, and the light came through. It was blue, not the blue of emergency systems or police strobes. Not any blue Rail had encountered in 31 years on the street. It was the blue of something that had traveled a very long way to find them. And it found them now with the patience of something that had never once been in a hurry. 2 of the passengers walked toward it. They didn't run. They didn't cry out. They simply stood and turned and walked with their arms slightly loose at their sides, like people heading to a counter to collect something they'd been expecting. A woman in a blazer, a teenager with headphones still around his neck. Gerald grabbed Deo by the collar and pulled him flat to the floor of the car and pressed his face against the ribbed rubber matting and said, "Don't look, don't look, don't look." Into the back of his skull. The blue light passed. It left 7 people standing where 8 had been. Rail lay there, for a moment, with his hand on the back of his son's head, and his cheek pressed against the matting, and listened to the sounds of the city being unmade above them. The vibration had changed. It was no longer the thrumming of approach. It was the heavier rhythm of harvest. There was a man in the corner of the car, civilian, no jacket, bleeding from somewhere above his hairline, where he'd hit the seat on the way down. See. He was watching the door where the blue light had come through. His name was Sontag, and he told them that later, when they had crawled into the access tunnel and pulled the grate behind them. He was a structural engineer. He knew these tunnels better than anyone who worked in the system because he'd spent 6 years patching the things that kept them from collapsing. And he told them this in the darkness without any apparent expectation of gratitude. Only because it was information they needed. He was also, as it turned out, colorblind, had been since birth, not fully. He distinguished shapes and contrasts well enough to navigate the world. But the specific wavelength the invaders used to trigger compliance in human neural tissue registered to him as something closer to gray. He'd looked directly at the light and felt nothing but a mild headache. He told them this the same way he told them about the tunnels, as information. "That's going to matter," Rail said. Sontag looked at him in the near dark. "How? I don't know yet. It's going to matter." They moved through the maintenance corridors for 4 hours, Sontag navigating by memory, and the occasional glow of his phone screen held low against the floor. There were others in the tunnels. They found them in clusters, hiding against the walls, some of them shaking, some of them eerily calm. A transit operator named Yemi, who had been running the southbound line and had simply refused to surface when the city started coming apart. A nurse named Audra, 8 months pregnant, who had been running a car home from a night shift, and who moved through the tunnels with a deliberateness that Rael found himself patterning himself against, because it was either that or lose his mind. Dio said almost nothing. He walked close behind his father, and when the tunnel was narrow enough, they walked single file, and Rael could feel his son's hand occasionally touch the back of his jacket. Not grabbing, just checking, just making sure. They surfaced near the marina. The city above them was not what any of them had left. The landmarks were wrong. Not destroyed, but repositioned in the mind. The way familiar things become unfamiliar when they are viewed through the right kind of terror. The ships were visible from here, low on the horizon, vast in the way that only oceans and mountain ranges are usually vast. Their hulls didn't catch lights, so much as they seemed to produce their own. A structural luminescence in the blue-gray range that made them look like a second skyline imposed above the original. How many? Dio said. Rael counted. Stopped counting. Enough, he said. The marina was chaos, but the specific kind of chaos that has structure. Human beings doing what human beings do in extremis, which is help each other. There were people attempting to launch boats. People trying to reach family on phone that had stopped connecting to anything. People standing at watching the ships the way you watch a storm that is already committed to arriving. Rael identified 3 other law enforcement officers by their body language before he saw their badges. He consolidated what he had. 6 functional people, one of them navigating by a kind of immunity he'd been born with, one of them carrying a child who had not yet decided to arrive, and found them a boat that was large enough and fueled enough to be useful. They didn't make it 200 meters. The light came from directly above, not the searching, sweeping kind from the first hours of the invasion. This was a fixed cone, targeted, closing like a hand around the boat and everything in it. And Rael had time to shout, "Stay down, cover your eyes," and then the boat was simply rising, and then they were inside the ship. The inside of the ship was the inside of something that had not been designed with human perception in mind. Not hostile to it, exactly, but indifferent in a way that was somehow worse than hostility. The geometry was consistent but not Euclidean. The surfaces were grown rather than built. That was the impression Rael got. Not manufactured but cultivated, the way a reef is cultivated. Over incomprehensible time, by incomprehensible patience. They were separated immediately. Not by force, by the mechanics of the place. Corridors that seemed straight and then weren't. Chambers that opened when you touched their walls and closed again while you were still deciding whether to enter. Deo was gone from Rael's side within the first 60 seconds, and Rael spent the next hour moving through the interior of the ship in a controlled panic, which is the only kind of panic a 31-year veteran of the lab allows himself. Found things in there. He found what had been done to the people who had been taken before them. There was a chamber. He didn't find it. It presented itself to him when a wall thinned and then became transparent, where human beings were suspended in a medium that was not water, but had water's properties of support and pressure. They were alive. He could see the slow rhythm of their chests, but their skulls had been opened, and what had been removed from them had been replaced with something the color of the blue light, something that pulsed with its own slow intelligence. And they were still alive, and they were no longer themselves. Rael stood at the transparent wall for exactly 4 seconds. He counted them. He allowed himself 4 seconds to understand what he was seeing, and then he moved on, because understanding it any further would have unmade him completely, and he could not afford that yet. He found Audra in a room that was warmer than the others. She had delivered her child in the time since they had been separated, alone, on a surface that had somehow reconfigured itself to accommodate her, which was the most alien thing Rael had yet encountered because it implied a kind of consideration he was not prepared to attribute to this place. The child was alive. Audra was alive. The child looked at Rael with eyes that were already focused, already tracking, which was not how newborns worked. "The light doesn't affect her," Audra said. Voice was steady in the way. Voices are steady after they have used up all their available fear. Rael crouched down and looked at the baby. The baby looked back at him. He had a sudden, total, irrational certainty, the kind that comes rarely in a long career, and is usually right, that this child was going to matter. He found Dio 3 corridors later. Dio was standing in the middle of a chamber that contained several of the suspended humans in their medium, and he was standing with the particular stillness of someone who has been standing there a long time. He turned when Rael came through the opening, and his eyes were clear and his expression was the worst expression Rael had ever seen on any face. In 31 years of working homicide, Dad, he said. They opened me up. There was a seam along the back of his skull, healed already, or healed as much as the ship's biology could heal it, but present. The thing they had placed there had done something to Dio. That was not the thing they had done to the humans in the chamber. He was still Dio. He was still entirely present. But there was something else present alongside him, something that ran parallel to his consciousness without merging with it. Like a river that has been rerouted to run next to another river, without the waters mixing. I can hear them, Dio said, not words. What? Intent. Rael stood in front of his son and put his hands on his son's shoulders and looked at him for a long moment. Does it hurt? No. Can you move? Yes. Can you fight? Dio looked at his father the way he'd looked at him across the transit car in the amber glow, the man's voice and the boy's eyes. Yeah, he said, I think I can fight. They found the others. They found Yemi barricaded in a maintenance junction he'd identified by some proprietary logic of infrastructure workers everywhere. The pipes ran the same way here as anywhere, serving the same purposes for different masters. They found Sontag moving through a section of the hull that was thinner than the rest, pressing his palm to the surfaces. With the attention of a man, reading a text in a language he's only beginning to learn. The skin of this thing, Sontag said when Rael reached him. It repairs itself, but it has to grow toward the damage. Like tissue. Like a wound closing. So if we made a wound big enough and in the right place. Sontag pressed his palm flat against the wall. I've been mapping it. Where it's thin, where the repair systems don't reach. He had been doing structural analysis on an alien starship for the last 90 minutes, using only his hands and his training and his irreplaceable colorblind eyes. Rael wanted to say something commensurate with that. Some acknowledgement proportional to what this man had quietly done in the dark while everything fell apart. But there wasn't language for it. So he just nodded and said where, and Sontag showed him. They brought down the ship, not easily, not without cost. Yemi hotwired the power routing in a junction that should have killed him because he understood power routing in the conceptual sense that transcends the specific system. Because current is current and load is load. And the alien's power grid had load problems like anything else. Sontag placed Rael and Dio at 2 specific points in the hull, not adjacent, separated by 100 meters and 2 corridors, and gave them the sequence and the timing. Rael pulled a conduit from the wall that was not a conduit in any technical sense but functioned as one, and he shorted it against the wall at the count of 3, and Dio did the same at the other point, and the hull stressed where Sontag had calculated it would stress, and then the entire ship was falling. They went through the atmosphere fast enough that the hull glowed. They hit the ground in a place that was green and mountainous and utterly unlike Los Angeles. And the ship's repair mechanisms engaged almost immediately, closing the hull behind them as they ran, so that by the time they reached what they would later learn was a river valley in Laos, the ship was already beginning to knit itself back together without them. Sarge died at the river's edge. That was what they had started calling Sontag on the ship. Not as a joke, but as a reflex. The way soldiers name each other in the field. The way the name becomes a form of respect. He had been hit by something in the final seconds before the crash. Some fragment of hull that had come loose in the stress fractures he himself had created. And he had not said anything about it, and had not slowed down, and he now sat at the river's edge and breathed carefully, and looked at the green mountains, and seemed entirely at peace. Tunnels, he said. And Rael thought he was confused, was returning to Los Angeles in his mind, but then Sontag said, start with the tunnels. Every city they come to, They'll use the infrastructure, the bones of the place. Get underground before the light. He died with his palm flat on the earth, reading it. People who found them at the river were not what Rael expected, which meant his expectations had been insufficient to this situation, which was something he was beginning to accept as the baseline condition of this new world. Sua was a compact, still man in his early 30s, who carried a bladed tool that had been modified from something Rael couldn't identify, and who looked at Rael's group the way Rael looked at crime scenes, with professional attention and without judgment. His sister Kanya had a rifle that was older than both of them and moved through the underbrush with the silence of someone who had spent years learning what the jungle would and would not forgive. They were fighters. They had been fighting the invaders since the first ship came down, which had been weeks ago here, the invasion having reached this part of the world before it reached California. They had been fighting with antiquated weapons and local knowledge, and the specific stubbornness of people who have defended the same land against different enemies for generations, and have not yet developed the habit of surrender. Sua looked at Dio for a long time, at the seam along the back of his skull, at his eyes. He's still in there, Rael said. Sua said nothing. He came down the ship with us. He helped bring it down. I know what's in him, Sua said. I know what it does. He's still my son. Sua's expression didn't change, but something in it shifted, the way a landscape shifts when a cloud moves. He looked at Rael, and then back at Deo, and then turned and led them into the jungle. Resistance compound was built into the skeleton of something much older, stone that had been fitted by hand, and had stood for 1,000 years before the people sheltering in it were born. There were perhaps 60 fighters in various states of readiness, a medical station run by a man named Harper, who had been a chemist before the invasion and was now whatever the situation required him to be. He examined the baby the way a person, something they recognize as important before they have language to explain why. Her blood's different, he said, looking at Rael over the child as if this needed contextualizing. Not wrong, different. It's like she's already started. He stopped and started again. The things they put in people, the implants, the control mechanism, it works through a specific cascade in the neural tissue, something they apparently mapped and refined. Her blood has markers I've never seen. It's like the DNA is already writing a response to what they do, already encoding resistance. Rael looked at the child. The child looked back at him with those already focused eyes. She was born in their ship, Audra said. In the middle of all that, whatever it is they project, she came into the world already being adjusted. Harper worked for 3 days. Rael did not have a clear sense of those 3 days as sequential time. They existed as a series of individual moments, with darkness in between, the mind imposing rest on a body that was not ready to concede the point. He learned the compound. He learned the fighters. He learned the specific grammar of this jungle, which was different from the grammar of every jungle I'd read about in briefings and never had moved through. What sounds meant safety and which ones meant the opposite, where the ground was solid and where it wasn't, which paths the aerial scouts could and couldn't see. Deo learned faster. The thing they had placed in him was not controlling him, but it was informing him, giving him access to the invaders' sensory logic, their patterns of attention, the rhythms of their surveillance. He described it to Rael one evening while they sat at the edge of the compound and watched the sky, where 2 of the ships were visible on the far horizon, vast and still as weather systems. It's like having a radio tuned to a frequency you can't turn off, Deo said. But I'm not receiving orders. I'm receiving geography, their version of it, what they're paying attention to and what they're ignoring. What are they ignoring? He paused. They're looking for her, the baby. Why? I don't know the why, just the intensity. He looked at his father. It's like watching someone search for something they lost and can't afford to lose. They had 3 days. They used them. Worked the chemistry with alien components salvaged from the ship wreckage, using the baby's blood as a template for something he couldn't fully name, but could produce in quantity. a compound that seemed to interact with the invader's control mechanism and interrupt it, not violently but terminally, the way a key turns a lock. He briefed Rael on the mechanism in terms that went approximately 40% over Rael's technical comprehension and 100% over his skepticism. If it worked the way Harper said it worked, it would turn the blue light red, turn the lock from outside to inside, would give every human being currently walking around in a biomechanical shell back the thing they'd lost when their skulls were opened, including Dio, Harper said, not as an offer, but as a fact, including Dio, Rael agreed. Kanya died on the third morning. She had been running the outer perimeter patrol, which she had insisted on running alone despite Sua's specific disagreement, because she knew the ground better than anyone, and because she was, as she put it, better company for herself than for anyone else at 5 in the morning. She found one of the four-legged units, the heavy ones, the kind they used for sustained ground assault rather than abduction, in the Eastern approach. And she did the calculation her brother had trained her never to do. The one where you weigh yourself against the asset you're protecting, and she ran from it rather than toward the compound. She led it southeast, into the minefield. The explosion was heard in the compound. Sua's face, for a moment, was the face of someone much younger, and then it was not. He stood in the entrance of the compound with his bladed tool in his hand, and looked toward the sound and said nothing. She bought us time, Rael said. She bought you time, Sua said. Not angrily, just precisely. Yeah, Rael said. She did. The ships came within the hour. Not 1-4. If information that implied they had located what they were looking for, and were converging rather than searching, the baby, or the signal the baby produced, or something about the density of human minds in one place. Whatever it was that pulled them, it had pulled them now. What followed was neither orderly nor chaotic. It was the specific violent middle ground that combat inhabits. Things happening faster than thought, decisions being made in the gap between stimulus and response, the body doing things the conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. The resistance fighters held positions they'd prepared over weeks. They'd learned what damaged the and what didn't, had calibrated their weapons accordingly. The compound's stone walls were older than the nation-state and had been built with military purpose and still served it. Rael moved through it with the contained attention of a man who has been in dangerous situations before and knows the most important thing about them is not to stop thinking. He had Harper's compound in an improvised delivery system that Harper had built from components Rael didn't want to examine too closely. A pressurized injector, essentially, the kind used for large animals, scaled to the task. He was looking for the ship. One of them had come down in the jungle 200 meters east of the compound, settling with the deliberate weight of something that doesn't need to hide what it is. Its forward section was open, a boarding ramp, not for personnel use, but for the transfer of cargo, which was the word they were using for human beings, because the invaders apparently used it too. Rael saw it from the compound wall, saw the configuration, and made the decision without consulting anyone, because consulting anyone would have taken time he didn't have. He ran. He made the ship in 40 seconds. He made the interior in 45. And the flagship, a transport, purpose-built, with the control architecture positioned closer to the functional center than the hull. He found it by feel, mostly, and by watching where the light was concentrated. The blue glow here was not passive but active. A weapon in storage, waiting to be deployed through a mechanism that was complex, in the way that all the invaders' biology was complex. Organic at the root, mechanical at the expression. The boundary between the two dissolved entirely. Hit the injector against the mechanism. He thought about Sontag, about the 4 seconds he'd allowed himself to understand something terrible, and how that was the right amount. He thought about Kanya running southeast with the heavy unit behind her, toward the minefield, making the calculation. He thought about his son standing in the corridor of the flagship with the seam along the back of his skull, and his eyes clear. Pushed the injector. The blue light went red, not immediately, not instantaneously, It spread from the point of injection outward through the mechanism, spread through water, displacing rather than mixing. And the red it made was not the red of danger or blood, but of something different. Something the human eye does not have precise language for, because it had never existed in nature before this moment. The red of a lock turning the other way. He heard it then. A sound from outside that was multiple sounds, resolving into coherence, the sound of the biomechanical units, the people the invaders had made into instruments, suddenly being handed back the instrument of themselves. And then, the invaders came into the ship. The alien leader was larger than the others, differentiated in the way that alpha status differentiates across biologies. Not in size alone, but in something more fundamental, a quality of attention, of intent, that the body communicated without reference to culture or language. It came with 3 others, and they moved with the efficiency of something that has never once doubted itself. And Rael thought, I am going to die in an alien spaceship in Laos, and then thought, no, I am not going to do that. He threw the injector at the leader, not as a weapon, as a distraction. The leader caught it, or the leader's equivalent of caught it. And in the half-second that attention was elsewhere, Rael moved, because 31 years of working homicide in Los Angeles teaches you a specific set of lessons about close-quarters improvised violence that translate, it turns out, across species lines. He moved toward the mechanism, not away from it. There was a secondary component, Harper had told him. In the transport ships, a relay point for the signal. The signal could be sustained in red rather than blue, broadcast rather than contained. He found it by the light. He always found things by the light. In the dark, it was the oldest skill he had. Older than the job, learned on childhood in a city that was always lit by something. The leader hit him from behind. He went into the wall and felt something in his shoulder give way and got up anyway, because the alternative was not acceptable, and turned to face it. He was saved by his son. Dio came through the opening in the hull at a speed that should not have been possible for human musculature, and was possible for what Dio currently was. And what Dio currently was turned out to be a thing the alien leader had a specific reaction to, because it had been intended as a thing they controlled, and here it was, uncontrolled, moving against the direction of its design, with all the force of everything the design had added to it. Dio was a young man who had grown up in Los Angeles, with a father who worked homicide, and who had learned, by proximity, if not by instruction, how to fight in the specific way of people who have something to protect. What he fought like now was that, plus everything else. It was not a clean fight. It was the kind of fight that has no aesthetic dimension at all. That is only about who stops first. And Dio did not stop. The alien leader went into the wall and then into the mechanism, and then it was over. The way fights always end, not with a declaration but with a stillness. A moment when one thing has ceased and another has not. Dio stood in the red light, breathing hard. He looked at his father. The relay, Rael said. Dio found it in 5 seconds. His hands on it. The hands of the son. The man's hands. The hands that had grown up in the shadow of this father's hands, and were their own hands now. And then the relay opened, and the red light went out of the ship and into the frequency the invaders used to control what they'd taken. And it spread from that point the way it had spread through the mechanism, displacing rather than mixing. And from all across the valley came the sound of people being handed back themselves. It was not a sound Rael had a reference for. It was the loudest thing he had ever heard. In the hours after, they counted. They counted what they had and what they'd lost and they sat with both numbers and didn't try to balance them, because they don't balance. Was gone. Several of the resistance fighters were gone. Kanya was gone. Sontag, Sarge, was gone. The math was the math that all victories require, and Rael had been adding it up since the first week on the job, and it had never stopped being heavy, and he was glad it hadn't. He was glad that number still weighed something. He was glad he was still capable of being crushed by it. Sua sat with him for a while. They didn't talk. The sun was going down behind the mountains, and the ships were still visible on the horizon, but none of them were moving. And whether that meant they were waiting or reassessing, or something else entirely, was not knowable yet. Son, Sua said finally. Yeah. What happens to him now? Rael thought about the seam along the back of his skull, about the parallel river, the one that ran alongside Deo's consciousness, without merging, about the frequency he couldn't tune out, the geography of the invader's attention. He's still my son, Rael said. I know, Sua said. That's not what I asked. Rael thought about it for a long time. The sun moved. He's both things, Rael said, and they don't cancel each other out. They compound, like Harper's compound. The one thing works on the other thing, and you get something that's neither. But that's stronger than either would have been on its own. Sua was quiet for a moment. Good. Audra came and sat with them. The baby was asleep against her shoulder, which was remarkable given everything. And in sleep, the child's face was the face of someone who has already made her peace with the world she has arrived in. The world as it will be from now on, rather than the world as it had been. She would grow up in a world that contained the invaders. She would grow up in a world that contained the frequency and the red light and the ruins of a compound in the mountains of Laos, where people had held a line until the line held back. She would grow up knowing what humans do when something larger comes for them. The ships on the horizon didn't move. It was possible they were waiting for something. It was possible they were recalculating. It was possible that somewhere in the cold interior architecture of their intelligence, something registered the red light and the thing it meant. That the mechanism had been turned. That the humans it had been designed to make into instruments had been given back the capacity to play a different song entirely. Taked. Rael looked at the horizon and thought about tunnels. About Sontag's voice in the dark. Start with the tunnels. They'll use the infrastructure. Get underground before the light. The invaders had come with superior technology, superior numbers, a biological weapon refined over what must have been generations. A weapon that reduced humanity to raw material, that opened skulls and removed what made people people, and replaced it with something in service of their needs. They had done this to cities. They were doing it to the world. What they hadn't accounted for was what happens when the material starts reading the weapon back. When the blind man looks at the hypnotic light and feels only a mild headache. When the structural engineer starts mapping the weaknesses in your hull while you're busy processing your inventory of mines. When the chemist, the drug chemist, the man who used to synthesize controlled substances in the back rooms of pharmaceutical labs, looks at your control mechanism and starts drafting a response. When the woman giving birth in your ship brings a child into the world already encoding resistance. When the detective's son, the one they cracked open and put their technology into, uses that technology to find every weak point in their formation, and then fights his way through it on behalf of a people the invaders had not thought to include in their threat assessment. Humans, Rael thought, and the word contained the whole weight of the evening. The mountains, the sleeping child, his son with his hands, still slightly trembling from the thing that had lived in them. Humans, Rael thought, and the thought was not triumphant, it was just true. The ships on the horizon still hadn't moved by the time the stars came out. Deo sat next to his father and they looked at the ships and the stars. And the stars were more than the ships. And the ships were still there. And tomorrow would be harder than today, and today had contained the kind of hard that breaks most things. And they were not broken, Dad, Deo said. Yeah, the speech, the one you had. Rael was quiet. For when you picked me up. You had one, didn't you? Had a whole architecture, Rael said. Tell me anyway. Rael thought about it. The transit car and the amber glow. The speech he'd been building for 3 years. What it had contained and what it had not contained. And what had turned out to matter and what hadn't. It was mostly just, he said, and stopped. The mountains were very dark. The stars were very many. The ships were still there, and they were very large, and tomorrow they would still be there, and they would still be large. And that was the condition of the world now, and inside that condition, human beings would keep doing the thing they had always done, which was find the tunnels, read the walls, run toward the minefield, push the injector, bring each other back. Was mostly just that I missed you, Rael said. The fire in the compound behind them crackled once and settled. His son put his hand on his arm. The man's hand, scarred now, healed in ways that were not quite human and not quite alien either, but entirely his, and left it there. The ships on the horizon held their position. They would move eventually. Everything moves eventually. Tonight, though, the stars were more than the ships. Tonight, that was enough.